As mentioned earlier, the international community has been pretty much united in its condemnation of the military's takeover of power in Sudan. Some quarters have either halted funding or have issued a warning on the same. Sudan had previously been hit by sanctions imposed in the country, mostly by the United States, during the rule of the ousted President Omar al-Bashir. Washington imposed some crippling sanctions on his regime for allegedly sheltering Islamic extremists, including the Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden in the 90s. Mr. Bashir was eventually toppled by the military in April 2019 after waves of street protests. Activity is slowly resuming in parts of Khartoum, but residents are complaining there about a lack of supplies.
Movement is not the same as before. Today is the first day we're attending the market after the events, and the movement is not the same as before. The number of shoppers is fewer. It is not the same as before the events. Before then, the market movement was excellent, but when the recent events occurred, the movement of buying and selling decreased.
During my tour in Omdurman market, I noticed that some commodities have decreased in price. Sugar has become £20, yet it was previously £40. The situation has become very good.
All right then, so where exactly does Sudan go from here, specifically Sudan's military? Let's explore some options with Aly Verjee. He's from the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg over in Sweden. He joins us now on the program. Ali, good to see you on the program. So some funding lines to Sudan being cut off, as we saw with the World Bank's suspension of program disbursements. But is this sufficient to get General al-Burhan to change course?
I doubt it is sufficient. These funding lines don't necessarily directly affect the military, which is well insulated from immediate economic pressure, controls a lot of the economy itself. And so it doesn't necessarily have enough to change course by itself. But it's an incremental action. There have been a number of actions, as you've been reporting, and so it contributes to that overall sense of dismay, which hopefully will change course.
But this is the same institution that essentially has been working under sanctions for a fairly long period of time. So arguably, they've basically learned to make do with, for lack of a better word, being cut off from most of the global economy, haven't they?
Well, exactly. The military, as I said, controls a large part of the Sudanese economy. And as you said, there is a lot of experience of dealing with this. At the same time, the economic situation overall in Sudan has been deteriorating, steadily so. And so it isn't necessarily that the military regime is entirely immune to the effects of what happens, but clearly they do have experience of dealing with these kinds of situations.
This is an interesting hypothetical, but is there a face-saving exit from this situation for General al-Burhan? Is one even possible?
I think it'd be very difficult for him to find a way to back down. He's clearly been thinking about doing this for some time, and taking the actions and taking the repressive actions that have unfolded over the last few days suggests that he's committed to his course of action. So I'm not sure he will back down personally. And we've seen in the past, not only after Bashir was toppled, but the first military government that tried to take power, the first general before Burhan, also faced a very similar situation, and he didn't last very long either. So I think Burhan is very much committed to the course of action he's taken, and probably won't find it so easy to back down.
So where then does this leave all the other key economic problems that the country had? Because they were working on getting a debt write-off from, I believe it was under the highly indebted highly indebted poor countries initiative, $56 billion of debt that they needed to essentially get through. This is all that work that had been done by Prime Minister Hamdok. That's essentially out the window now, isn't it?
I think it's on pause for the time being, probably not completely out the window, but certainly at danger of being so. The multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF are not going to support a military government in Sudan. And so that kind of multilateral relief isn't going to happen. And it really makes Sudan turn towards countries that might be more amenable to supporting it financially, but those aren't necessarily part of these multilateral institutions in the same way.
Okay, then. So what about the regional picture that we're dealing with here? Because Sudan, what's happening in Sudan doesn't just affect the country. South Sudan, for example, its oil revenue essentially goes right through the country. Sudan was in the middle of negotiations with Egypt and Ethiopia about the GERD. Sudan's also being affected by the spillover from the conflict in northern Ethiopia, in Tigray province. Walk us through the regional implications here.
It certainly does have a number of regional implications. First, Sudan was chairing the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, this regional organization, which, although weak, is ostensibly responsible for addressing the regional crises that arise. Prime Minister Hamdok had tried to intervene to mediate a solution in Tigray. He didn't have much success in doing so, but clearly a military government in Sudan will have even less interest in finding a solution there. You mentioned the GERD. Sudan has been moving towards the Egyptian position for the last couple of years, and that's probably going to continue. But the real question is, will there be restraint when it comes to not only the GERD, but also the contested borderlands between Sudan and Ethiopia? And again, in the military-civilian government that was there just a few days ago, there was a tension between them on these kinds of issues, but there was also a balance. And so there was a degree of restraint being exercised. If the civilian element of the transitional government in Sudan is no longer there, then that same restraining function doesn't really exist anymore. And then with respect to other regional crises, whether that's in South Sudan or Somalia or indeed anywhere else, Sudan is a very big and important country. And if it is itself in crisis, then it clearly can't play a very effective role anywhere else.
Indeed. One last question for you. We started with the money question. Let's wrap up with that. If all these other funding lines are being chopped off, the World Bank saying, yeah, the $1.9 billion program we'd agreed on, that's essentially on pause. Debt relief, not essentially going to happen for a bit. What other countries might bankroll Sudan and why?
Well, this is the $1 million or perhaps the $1 billion question, and people are pointing to countries in the Gulf as being the likely patrons, whether Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. They have, of course, been rather discreet about any indication that they will come forward with lots of money, and I don't expect they would ever publicly, at least for the time being, make those kinds of announcements. But these are the countries that are rumored to be financially interested in supporting the military. Clearly, they do have interest in the region. Clearly, they have supported other military-led governments in the region as well. And in terms of their overall economic output, supporting Sudan is not particularly costly if you consider the other expenses that these countries have. So they can afford to do it. The question is, what do they want in return, and how far does that largesse continue, and what conditions does it come with?
Indeed, we'll see how this plays out. Aly Verjee from the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Thank you very much.